Two things to cover this morning. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul writes verses 1 through 5. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship and the ministering to the saints. And not only as we hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of our God. Hope your giving is doing good. I hope that you are mindful of the need to give as you ought to. The elders talked about the budget this morning. We usually look at that toward the beginning of the year. We analyze a lot of goals. We look at ourselves. You look at yourself. It's a private matter. I'll ask a question according to the scriptures there. Are you giving as you ought to? Now I want to talk about leadership. I read some story some time back about this church that was quite active in giving things away. And on a certain day, they opened the doors and a person would be sitting there at the desk just taking down notes. A person would come in and say, I need this, and he'd write down whatever, and I need that, and what do you need, and how much you need, etc. And about that time, the bloodmobile came driving up. A person got out and walked up to the desk, and the lady with her head down was taking notes, and she said, what would you like? How much money do you need? And she said, I didn't come for money. I came for your blood. She looked up. Well, I didn't come for your money, but I come for your blood this morning. Come for your life. I want to talk about leadership. Finances are important. Our giving to God is important. It is not just a budget matter. We live off of a budget and deal with budgets, but it's not just a budget matter. But it's a matter of expression to God of how much you love Him. Leadership is also an important matter for us and who we are as Christians. And as we look toward what I think the elders are very actively working toward here is the idea that leadership, get a little competition here, that leadership is a matter for each one of us as individuals. Who is your leader? Do you have a variety of leaders? Probably so, depending on the characteristics that you're looking for. Developing characteristics is an important matter for us in our leadership. We look to those people we admire and we see that and we say, that's my leader in that area. Some of you maybe during these next couple weeks will be looking to somebody like Peyton Manning and saying, wow, what a leader. He exhibits not only some good attributes out on a football field, by the way, if you don't know, he's quarterback for Denver. But he's also an excellent person in his characteristics. But I look to leaders in the congregation, I think back to some of the elders that we had in some years past, and I think, well, what leaders we have nowadays and had back then. I'm so grateful for the elders we have today and the commitment that they have made to our congregation. I think back to men like Gene Arnold, Herb Goff, Jack Baker that we had some years ago that challenged me as a leader, our elders as leaders, and for those that knew them at that day and time, and what an inspiration they were, and we admire them. They're leaders for us because of the characteristics that they had. But what if you don't want to be a leader? You just want to sit in your own little corner, your little slot in the pew, and you want to come to church, and you want to give, and you want to pray and take the Lord's Supper and sing, and that's what you want, and nothing more. But I like to give you a new twist on this. And that is that each one of us, in a way, are leaders. And that the day that you committed yourself to Christ in baptism, it was a commitment to leadership of a way. That in Matthew chapter 5, as Jesus is talking to his people, including religious leaders that might be around, and all those disciples that were listening to him, when he called in verses 13, 14, 15, etc., and 16, that told them that they were salt and light, that it was a challenge for them to be leaders, to be different, distinct from the rest of the world like salt would be, to make a difference, to be light to the rest of the world, to say, this is where we ought to be going, as if to say, I have a path for you to follow. Let me lead you. That each one of us, no matter who we are a leader of a sort. And quite possibly there are people about you that look to you for those characteristics to lead. Now, that doesn't mean that each one of us leads large numbers, but we have people that look to us. Now, I believe that God does call some of us to lead larger numbers, but each one of us leads in a different way. We look at John chapter 1, verse 41. There's a character at the beginning of the Gospel of John named Andrew. And after having heard this Jesus speak, he goes and he finds his brother Peter and he leads him to Jesus. And then right after it, another individual. His name is Philip. And Philip hears Jesus and he goes to his brother and he says, you need to hear this Jesus. And there's a little discussion going on because how can anything be great that comes out of Nazareth? Well, come see. I challenge you. And so these men lead individuals to them. In Acts chapter 2, the apostles led thousands to Jesus. And then after that, they led a church. In Acts chapter 4, there's a man named Barnabas. Well, he's given that nickname actually, but before that time, he had a different name. But the apostles called him Barnabas because his inspiration and his motivation in the way that he gave. And it led the church and led the apostles in a direction that was valuable. In Acts chapter 6, there's 7 men that are chosen because they're just good at managing and helping take care of things. And so they led a benevolence group in a rather large church at that day of time, in a crucial time for the church. But they were leaders. In Acts chapter 10, there's an individual named Cornelius. After hearing about the apostles and what's going on, then he leads his family to hear the message of Jesus. But I know, and you know, that not everybody wants to be a leader. Matter of fact, some of the greatest leaders of our time really didn't want to be leaders to start with. I think of individuals that were civilians of a nature in December 1942 when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And yet they stepped up and said, I will go. And when they left and joined the Army, the Marines, or the Navy, or whatever, they developed qualities of leadership. And that group, when they came home, although they didn't want to go, they went. When they came back, became leaders of our nation. And are described quite, I think, adequately by Brokaw as some of the greatest generation that we've ever had. It wasn't that they chose to be leaders as much they were pushed into that. But they stepped forward and took it just the same. I think of a character in the Old Testament, a man named Moses, that pretty much fits that kind of style. When God first calls Moses in Exodus 3, he's not real attuned to this idea of leading or going, and yet God doesn't have anybody else in mind. Well, the discussion goes on, and Moses has his excuses about why he doesn't want to go. Who am I, verse 11 of chapter 3 of Exodus, he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and should bring the children out of Egypt? I'm not that kind of a person. Maybe he's thinking back 40 years ago when he was in Pharaoh's household before he was escorted or ran out, actually. Maybe he was a better suited leader at that day and time, but he doesn't think he is now. And he comes up with all kinds of persons. Well, if they tell me, who am I going to say you are? I don't even know your name. And he goes on through this chapters here, and he goes on, and God's not happy with this. Because he chose in Moses just the same. Verse 1 of chapter 4, Moses answers, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord's not appeared to you. And on his excuses go. Sometimes we have excuses for why we don't step up and take a task. Why do we not want to lead? Well, we look at the task and we say, that's more than I can handle. Surely, just like Moses, there's got to be somebody else better out there suited for the task. Finally, at the very end, he just begs God, just find somebody else. There was no one else. God had chosen him. He accepted the challenge and he stepped forward. There are times for men and women in their appropriate roles to step forward and be leaders. Is this the time for you? Next week we're going to look in a little more detail about leadership, what Paul describes as qualifications for elders and for deacons. It's going to be a quick survey in one lesson. We're going to leave you some pamphlets or handouts to look at that will identify those characteristics, because those are important as we think about putting in new elders or new deacons here at Central. But we have to recognize there's a general principle out there about leadership qualities that were totally missed, I think, in a lot of God's people when Jesus began his ministry. Take a look for just a moment with me at Matthew chapter 5. Just for a few minutes, I want to glance at these characteristics and ask you to think about yourself. You see, I think that God's leaders, not our country's leaders, not our government, but God's leaders demonstrate something different. They don't demonstrate how much they know. They don't demonstrate how well they're able to manage people. They don't demonstrate maybe an acute knowledge of how to deal with budgets or large, vast businesses. But they demonstrate how much God is in control of their life. I think that's what a leader has to do. I think a person becomes a leader within the church, whether he is named a leader or not, when he demonstrates that God is in control of my life. And I think that's very well how Moses fit the qualification that God needed. That when he didn't feel like he was suited for the task, he was still willing to step up eventually and say, I'll go. God gave him the tools along the way that he would need in his leadership journey. Piece by piece, bit by bit. It was a struggle. When you look at the story of Moses, there's no way that you can read that and think that it was an easy leadership task. But he was willing to step forth because he had the qualifications and God was with him. Now as Jesus comes into the world and he looks about at God's people and those that are leading, and he analyzes what's not there, the fact is that God was not in charge of their lives. So he starts in Matthew chapter 5 with the verse 3 and says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn over their own lack, of course, of spirituality, for you shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." These are individuals that not only will be blessed when they take on these characteristics, but become blessings for others. They rise up above the rest by exhibiting that God is now in charge. I'm not in charge of my attitude. I'm going to be a poor spirit. I'm going to let God take control. You say, well, God has control. But God's given us a free will. And you can choose. And by so doing, and letting still God control, we exhibit, I'm in submission to my Lord. He's going to be leading me. Exhibiting that kind of characteristic, that hungering and thirsting for what's right in a situation where a world needs people to hunger and thirst for that. And yet submitting to God along the way in a meek attitude is exactly what God needs from each individual. Those are personality characteristics that have to be within each one of us and must be within our leaders when we think about it. God's leaders, let God be in control. And that inspires others to be like them. Look for the leader in you. Look for how God controls in your life. Let him have reign in you. And then as we glance at the characteristics only today of 1 Timothy, and then next week we'll study in detail this man who desires to be a bishop. Chapter 3, verse 2 is one that's blameless. He's a husband of one wife. He has a temperate, sober-minded attitude, good behavior. He's hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, and on and on. All these characteristics are things that every Christian should aspire to, except for the women aspiring to be husbands, head of a wife. But all that temperate, God in control, leadership. God calls us to be so uniquely different than the rest of the world. And when a person has that kind of lifestyle, it just makes a difference in the rest of the world. Friends, co-workers, classmates, they sit up and notice it. Neighbors recognize there's something different, something unique, something that exhibits Jesus in every way. As we think about where we're headed this year, whether we choose 10 deacons or 20 or whatever in this process of time, or whether there'll be an elder, whatever might come out of this, each one of you look at yourself and say, am I aspiring to be the kind of Christian that God would have me to be? These qualities and these characteristics that represent Jesus, all the time. Not just when I'm in church or with a bunch of Christians, but when I'm in places separate from that. That I still stand up and represent Jesus. That the world sees there's something distinct in me. And it inspires them to follow. Think about leadership this week. Analyze these passages. We're going to come back and talk about them next week. But as you look at your life, if you think you're falling short and you need to make a change, there's room down front. We sing a song to encourage you. And if you've never made a commitment to Jesus Christ, never been baptized into Christ, then why don't you come do that? Do you need a prayer? Do you need a change? Come down front while we stand.